Daniel Brooks stood in front of the mirror, his fingers lightly tracing the outline of his tie. He had always been a perfectionist, but tonight there was something different in the air. The excitement that had been building inside him for weeks now felt heavier, more profound. He had carefully planned this evening down to the last detail. It was meant to be a surprise for Clara, his wife of 8 months. They had been through so much together, getting married in a whirlwind romance, adjusting to life as a married couple, and navigating the pressures of their respective careers. Now, Daniel wanted to give Clara something special, something that would remind her of how much he loved her. At 34, Daniel had worked hard to establish his career in tech. Known for his brilliant mind and calm demeanor in high-pressure situations, he was the kind of person who had it all together. He had always taken pride in the fact that he could keep his emotions in check. He was the Rock. But tonight, as he surveyed the sleek suit and perfectly knotted tie, his nerves got the better of him. He felt vulnerable, his heart racing in anticipation. Clara had always been his anchor. She was kind, empathetic, and seemed to possess an inner light that drew everyone around her. At 29, she was an elementary school teacher, adored by her students and colleagues alike. When she had agreed to marry him, Daniel had been on cloud 9, overwhelmed by the thought of spending the rest of his life with someone so beautiful inside and out. The wedding had been nothing short of magical, a celebration of love that everyone in their town still talked about. Yet, tonight there was a gnawing sensation at the back of his mind. Clara had seemed distant lately, preoccupied with something he couldn't quite put his finger on. The moments of connection that used to come so easily between them had grown few and far between. Still, he clung to the idea that their love was strong, that their bond could withstand any storm. After checking the clock one last time, he took a deep breath and headed downstairs. The house smelled of the carefully prepared meal he had cooked for them, the soft glow of candlelight flickering against the walls. It was perfect. Clara would be so happy, he thought. He imagined her walking through the door with that radiant smile of hers, her eyes lighting up when she saw the dinner he had prepared. He couldn't wait to see her face. But as the minutes ticked by, an unsettling silence filled the room. Clara was late. Daniel checked his phone, his fingers nervously swiping the screen. There was no message, no missed call. He tried to calm his nerves, but a sense of unease settled in his chest. Clara had never been this late without letting him know. He dialed her number, his heart pounding in his ears as it rang. It went to voicemail. "Hey babe, just wondering where you are. Everything's ready here. Call me when you get this, okay? Love you." He hung up, trying to dismiss the rising tension. Something was wrong. Before we dive deeper into this shocking story, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. Turn on notifications so you don't miss a single twist in this unbelievable case. Meanwhile, at St. Joseph's Church, Pastor Harrison Blackwell sat in the dimly lit, his brow furrowed in concentration as he reviewed his sermon for the upcoming Sunday. The office, once a place of solace and reflection, had recently become a sanctuary for more than just spiritual guidance. At 47, Harrison had built a reputation as a compassionate pastor, a man whose sermons moved the congregation and whose steady presence had been a fixture of the town for over a decade. He had counseled countless couples, officiated weddings, and provided guidance in times of hardship. But there was a secret Harrison harbored, one that gnawed at him every waking moment, an affair with Clara Brooks. It had started innocently enough. Small conversations during her volunteer work at the church, shared moments of vulnerability, and a connection that neither of them had expected. At first, Harrison tried to ignore the pull he felt toward her. She was married and he was the pastor. The lines between right and wrong were supposed to be clear. Yet, as the months wore on, those lines blurred, and what had once been a platonic friendship morphed into something more. Now, the guilt weighed heavily on him, yet he couldn't bring himself to end it. The temptation, the passion that had ignited between them, was too strong to resist. Tonight, he had arranged to meet Clara in the church office. The place was quiet, with only the soft murmur of the air conditioning filling the space. His mind was distracted, preoccupied with thoughts of her and the impossible situation he had gotten himself into. As he glanced at the clock, he knew she would be here soon. Clara's heels echoed through the empty church hallways as she approached Pastor Harrison's office. Her heart pounded in her chest, each step seemingly louder than the last. She had never felt more conflicted. She loved Daniel with all her heart. He was a good man, kind and thoughtful. But there was a void between them that she couldn't ignore. Despite his best efforts, Daniel had grown distant, wrapped up in his work and his ambition. Clara often felt like she was fading into the background of their marriage, like her voice and her needs were no longer a priority. And then there was Harrison. He saw her. He understood her in a way Daniel hadn't been able to for months. There was a deep connection between them, something that Clara had never expected, something that scared her. She knew what they were doing was wrong, but in those quiet, stolen moments, everything else seemed to fade away. Tonight she couldn't resist the pull. As she stood in front of the office door, her hand hovered over the knob. For a split second, her mind flashed to Daniel, his kind eyes, his reassuring smile. She had promised to love him, to be faithful. And yet, here she was, about to betray him in the most unimaginable way. But the temptation was too great. With a deep breath, Clara opened the door. The heavy wooden door to Pastor Harrison's office creaked slightly as Clara stepped inside. She quickly closed it behind her, feeling a rush of heat and anticipation flood her body. The church, silent and empty at this hour, felt strangely intimate, almost like the walls were holding its breath, waiting for what would unfold next. Pastor Harrison looked up from his desk, his expression softening the moment he saw her. "Clara?" His voice was a low murmur filled with longing and something deeper, darker. He stood up slowly, his tall figure moving toward her with deliberate steps. "I wasn't sure you would come tonight." Clara felt a twinge of guilt, of something even more unsettling. She had been wavering, torn between duty and desire. But now that she was here, the moment felt inevitable. She had crossed a line and there was no going back. "I shouldn't be here," she whispered, though her voice lacked the conviction she was hoping for. The words seemed empty in the quiet room, mere formalities. Her fingers clenched at the fabric of her blouse, her knuckles white with tension. Pastor Harrison stopped just inches from her, his eyes dark with something she couldn't place. He reached out and gently cupped her cheek, the touch sending a shiver down her spine. "You're here because you're meant to be. This is how it's supposed to be, Clara. You know that. God brought us together." Clara blinked, her throat tight. For a moment, she almost wanted to laugh at the absurdity of his words, of the way he twisted God's will into something that served only his desires. But instead, she found herself tilting her head slightly into his hand, surrendering to the intoxicating pull of his gaze. "I don't know any more," Clara murmured, her voice cracking. "Don't think," he said softly, almost tenderly. "Just feel." And with that, he closed the distance between them, pressing his lips against hers. She hesitated for just a fraction of a second before her body betrayed her, melting into his embrace. All the moral lines she had drawn for herself seemed to dissolve as his kiss deepened, the heat between them building quickly, consuming her. Her rational mind screamed at her to stop, to think of Daniel, of the vows she had made. But the fire burning in her chest was too strong, and she was swept up in the madness of the moment. She pulled him closer, her hands tangling in his shirt, feeling his warmth, his urgency. The longer they kissed, the more her sense of guilt blurred. There was no time, no space for rational thought. There was only Harrison, only the overwhelming chemistry that seemed to defy everything she had once believed in. Meanwhile, across town, Daniel sat at the dinner table, the candles flickering softly, casting long shadows on the walls of their dining room. His stomach twisted with a mixture of excitement and confusion. It wasn't like Clara to be out this late without a word. His concern had escalated into something worse, a growing sense of dread that clung to him like a cold mist. He checked his phone again. No message, no missed calls. Still nothing. As the minutes passed and the silence grew heavier, he stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the quiet street. It was a clear night, the stars twinkling faintly in the sky. He rubbed his temples, trying to shake off the gnawing feeling in his gut. "Where are you, Clara?" he muttered to himself. "What's going on?" Suddenly his mind shifted. Clara had mentioned St. Joseph's Church earlier in the week, talking about a charity event she might volunteer for. It was the only place he hadn't checked. Hope surged in his chest and he quickly grabbed his keys, deciding that it was worth checking. Maybe she had just lost track of time. Clara and Pastor Harrison had lost themselves in the heat of their passion. His hands roamed over her, pulling at the fabric of her blouse, his breath heavy as he kissed her neck. She was caught in the moment, the guilt and fear melting away with each touch. Her heart raced, not from fear of the consequences, but from the wild, reckless abandon that had overtaken her. She had never experienced anything like this before. Everything else in her life seemed so controlled, so perfect. But here with Harrison, it was raw, unpredictable, and intoxicating. As he guided her to the desk, Clara barely registered the shift in the air. The world outside this office felt distant, irrelevant. There was only this, only him, only the way his body moved with hers. It felt like everything she had been craving for months, Someone to truly see her, someone to understand the emptiness she had tried to fill with work, with marriage, with the perfect life. But now, as their bodies came together in the dim light of the church office, she couldn't deny the deeper truth. This was wrong. And yet, in the chaos of desire, she couldn't stop. Daniel's car sped down the quiet streets of their town, his mind racing with possible scenarios. He passed the school, the coffee shop, and even the gym where Clara sometimes worked out. No sign of her. Panic began to rise in his chest. His grip tightened on the steering wheel. Where was she? He glanced at his watch. Almost 2 hours had passed since he'd last heard from her. There was no explanation for her silence. The further he drove, the more his thoughts spiraled. Was she in danger? Had something happened to her? The church? Clara had mentioned it earlier. That was the last place he hadn't checked. His heart lifted slightly, a faint flicker of hope cutting through the anxiety. St. Joseph's Church loomed in the distance, a dark silhouette against the night sky. The familiar steeple rose like a quiet sentinel, its shadow stretching long across the parking lot. Daniel parked near the side of the building, his heart pounding as he stepped out of the car. He could see a faint light spilling from one of the office windows. His mind raced. It was too quiet here. Too still. His pulse quickened and with cautious steps he approached the office window. He squinted, trying to make out the figures inside. The sounds of soft murmurs reached his ears, and at first he thought they were innocent, perhaps just a couple of people preparing for an event. But then the muffled noises grew louder, clearer. He froze. His heart seemed to stop in his chest. Gasp. Soft moans. The unmistakable sounds of passion. For a long, agonizing moment, Daniel stood there, unable to move, unable to comprehend what was happening in front of him. His mind struggled to process it. The woman he loved, his wife, the woman he had married just 8 months ago, was in the arms of another man. And not just any man. Pastor Harrison, the man who had officiated their wedding, the man who had counseled them in their marriage, the man who had been a trusted figure in their community. The world seemed to shift beneath Daniel's feet as the realization hit him like a sledgehammer. He couldn't breathe. Daniel's breath caught in his throat as the reality of the situation began to settle in. Every muscle in his body tensed, and for a moment, everything went silent in his mind. He could still hear the muffled sounds through the church office window, sounds that pierced through his thoughts like a jagged knife. He blinked, trying to clear the fog from his mind. This couldn't be real. He had to be imagining it. There was no way Clara, the woman he loved, the woman he had married in front of their friends, family, and Pastor Harrison himself, could betray him like this. But as he stepped closer to the window, he saw them. His heart sank. Clara, her clothes disheveled, her hair wild, was pressed against the desk, tangled with Pastor Harrison. The pastor's hands were on her, his lips on hers, moving with a rhythm that was far too familiar, far too intimate. The sight hit Daniel like a punch to the gut, a cold, suffocating wave of disbelief flooding over him. For a moment, his body seemed frozen, caught between shock and rage. He stumbled back, his chest heaving as his mind reeled, unable to process the sight before him. This couldn't be happening. Not here. Not with him. He had trusted Harrison, looked up to him, admired his unwavering faith. How could he do this? How could Clara do this? Daniel's thoughts spiraled, his mind filled with the overwhelming image of his wife. His perfect, kind, loving wife, betraying him with the very man who had helped build their lives together. His breath came in shallow gasps as his emotions boiled over. It was as if everything he had known to be true about his marriage was suddenly ripped away, leaving nothing but a hollow ache in its place. Without thinking, his hands clenched into fists, his mind shutting out any rational thought. His pulse thundered in his ears as anger, raw and unrelenting, surged through him. He couldn't just stand there. He couldn't let this betrayal go unanswered. Daniel's feet carried him forward, almost against his will. His mind was a haze of fury, but deep down, something told him this moment was a long time coming. For weeks now, he had felt the distance between him and Clara growing. He had pushed those feelings aside, blaming his work or the stress of life. But standing here, seeing this, it was clear. The distance had been there all along, even when he had tried to ignore it. He charged toward the church's front door, his footsteps heavy against the pavement. Each step was filled with purpose, yet his heart pounded with the dread of what was to come. He had no plan, no strategy. His mind was too consumed by the betrayal to think straight. All he knew was that he had to confront them. He had to face Clara, face Harrison, and demand answers, even if he couldn't yet make sense of the hurt that had exploded in his chest. He reached the door and threw it open with a force that made it slam against the wall. The sound echoed through the empty church like a thunderclap. Inside, Clara and Pastor Harrison broke apart, both of them frozen in shock at the sound of the door splintering open. Clara's wide eyes met Daniel's, and for the briefest moment she looked as though she wanted to run, to retreat into the shadows and erase what had just happened. But it was too late. The damage had been done. "Daniel," Clara whispered, her voice shaky, her hands fumbling to cover herself. I can explain." Daniel's jaw clenched, the fury in his chest choking off any words. His gaze shifted from Clara to Pastor Harrison, who was still standing by the desk, his own face a mixture of disbelief and guilt. "Explain?" Daniel's voice was a low growl, dangerous in its calmness. "Explain what? This is how you explain things now? With him? After everything?" His voice cracked, the weight of the words sinking in like poison. "How could you, Clara? With him? The man who married us? The man who gave us our vows? And you," he pointed a trembling finger at Harrison, "how could you preach about faithfulness on Sunday mornings and then do this?" Clara stood there, speechless, her tears now spilling over, her face flushed with guilt and shame. Pastor Harrison, on the other hand, was the first to react. He stepped forward, raising his hands in a futile attempt to calm the storm that was brewing in the room. "Daniel, please," Harrison said, his voice strained. "Let's talk. We need to talk about this calmly." But Daniel was beyond talking. His mind was consumed by one thing only, the sheer violation of everything he had ever believed in, everything he had trusted. His vision blurred with a sudden wave of adrenaline, and before he even knew what was happening, he was charging at Harrison. "Calm down." Clara screamed, but it was too late. In a single violent motion, Daniel's fist collided with Harrison's jaw, sending the pastor staggering back, his eyes wide with shock. For a moment the world seemed to stand still. Clara stood frozen, unable to move, her heart racing as the reality of what was happening set in. This wasn't just a confrontation, it was spiraling out of control. Daniel's anger, once a silent storm inside him, erupted like a volcano. He was no longer the calm, composed man Clara had known. The man who had patiently built their lives together was gone, replaced by someone she didn't recognize. The rage that poured out of him now was primal, pure and relentless. Harrison tried to defend himself, stumbling back to his feet. "Daniel, stop," he shouted, his voice filled with fear. "This isn't helping." But Daniel didn't hear him. He wasn't thinking about the consequences. He wasn't thinking at all. He was consumed by one thing, the burning need to make them both feel the pain he felt. With a roar of fury, he pushed Harrison back into the desk. Papers flew everywhere as the pastor stumbled, trying to regain his balance. In the chaos, Daniel's hand found something, a letter opener that had been resting on the edge of the desk. Without thinking, driven by an animalistic need for revenge, he lifted it in his hand, his eyes locked onto Harrison's terrified face. "No!" Clara screamed, but it was too late. In a blur of motion, Daniel thrust the letter opener forward. It struck Harrison in the eye, a sickening sound filling the room as the blade pierced flesh and bone. Harrison's scream of agony echoed through the office, but it barely registered in Daniel's mind. He stood there, his breath ragged, staring at the weapon protruding from Harrison's face. Blood pooled on the floor, and the scene became a nightmare of violence, rage, and regret. Clara's body shook with disbelief as she stumbled back, unable to look at what Daniel had just done. The man she had married, the man she had loved, had been consumed by the darkness of his own rage. "Harrison?" she whispered, her voice barely audible, her heart racing as she looked at the bloody scene before her. The pastor, once a pillar of the community, lay motionless, his life slipping away with each passing second. Daniel stood in a daze, his hands trembling, the gravity of his actions finally beginning to sink in. The sound of sirens wailing in the distance was the only thing that brought him back to reality. The room, once filled with chaos and violence, suddenly became still. Daniel's chest heaved with each breath as he slowly turned his eyes toward Clara. She looked at him with horror in her eyes, the look of a stranger, the look of someone who had never truly known him. "What have I done?" Daniel whispered, his voice breaking. He stumbled back, his legs giving way beneath him as he collapsed to the floor, overwhelmed by the enormity of the consequences he had just unleashed. Outside, the police were drawing closer, and Daniel knew that there was no escaping the nightmare he had created. The sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. They were coming for him, Daniel knew it. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, suffocating him as he sat there on the cold floor of the church office, his hands stained with Harrison's blood. The room seemed to close in around him, the reality of what he had done sinking in with each ragged breath. He had crossed a line, one from which there would be no return. He turned his eyes toward Clara, who was still standing at the edge of the room, her body trembling, her face a mask of horror and disbelief. The woman he loved, the woman he had trusted with everything, stood frozen, unable to look at him. Her eyes were wide, her lips parted in shock, her face pale, drained of color. "Clara," Daniel whispered, his voice cracking as he tried to find the words. He didn't know what to say, didn't know how to make sense of the nightmare he had just created. His body shook with adrenaline, and his mind was a whirl of guilt, regret, and confusion. "Clara, I didn't mean for this to happen." But Clara didn't move. She didn't say anything. The silence between them was deafening, filled with an unbearable tension. She just stood there, looking at him as if she didn't recognize him anymore. Behind him, the door to the office creaked open. The heavy footfalls of approaching police officers echoed down the hallway, their voices muffled but growing louder. "Daniel?" Clara suddenly exclaimed, her voice filled with urgency as she rushed to his side. "You have to go. They're coming. They're going to arrest you." Daniel looked up at her, his eyes wide with confusion. "What?" he asked, his breath shaky. "What do you mean? What about Harrison?" Clara swallowed hard, tears welling in her eyes as she struggled to speak. "He's not going to make it, Daniel. You did this." Her words faltered and she reached out to him, but her touch was hesitant, like she wasn't sure she should even be near him anymore. The sound of footsteps outside the office door grew closer, and Daniel's chest tightened as the gravity of the situation finally hit him. The sirens were so loud now, their screeching wail piercing through the tension in the room. The flashing red and blue lights could be seen through the window, illuminating the church parking lot in a strange, surreal glow. He didn't know what to do. He didn't know how to fix this. He had gone too far, hurt too many people, and now there was no escaping the consequences. He had crossed a point of no return. The door to the office swung open, and two uniformed officers stepped into the room. They paused for a moment, taking in the scene. One of the officers, a woman with sharp, observant eyes, immediately stepped forward, her gaze locking onto Daniel. "Daniel Brooks?" she asked, her voice firm, professional. Daniel nodded weakly, his throat tight with fear and regret. He felt like he was drowning in a sea of emotions, shame, anger, guilt, all crashing down on him at once. "You're under arrest for the assault of Pastor Harrison Blackwell," the officer continued, her voice unwavering. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Daniel didn't respond. His mind was numb, unable to process the enormity of what was happening. His life was unraveling before his eyes. His marriage, his career, his entire future. All of it was gone in an instant. All because of a moment of blind rage. As the officer moved toward him to cuff him, Clara finally broke her silence. "Daniel, please," she cried, her voice breaking. "Please don't go. Don't leave me." She stopped, her hand reaching for him as if she could somehow hold him back. But it was too late. The officers gently but firmly restrained him, cuffing his wrists behind his back. Daniel barely registered the cold metal of the cuffs biting into his skin. The whole world seemed to blur around him. The police officer's voice, Clara's sobs, the flashing lights outside, everything became a blur as they led him out of the office. The ride to the police station was a blur of flashing lights and heavy silence. Daniel sat in the back of the police car, staring out the window, his mind racing but unable to make sense of anything. His hands were cuffed behind his back, and every time the car hit a bump, he felt the sharp jolt in his chest. But it wasn't the physical pain that consumed him, it was the crushing weight of his own guilt, the sickening knowledge of what he had done. He thought about Clara. The look on her face when she saw him, the betrayal, the fear, the pain. She had trusted him, loved him, and now all of that was gone. How could she ever forgive him? How could he ever forgive himself? As the car turned onto the street that led to the police station, Daniel caught a glimpse of the church in the rearview mirror. It was just a building now. A place that had once symbolized faith, hope, and the foundation of his life. But now it was a monument to his destruction. It had been the place where everything had fallen apart, where he had lost himself. The police car finally pulled into the station, and Daniel was led inside, his heart heavy with the weight of the situation. His lawyer was waiting for him, but Daniel barely noticed. All he could think about was how his life had changed in an instant. How everything he had known and loved was slipping through his fingers. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed above as Daniel was seated in the interrogation room. His wrists were still sore from the handcuffs, and his head ached with the pressure of everything that had happened. The door opened and Detective Rachel Simmons walked in, followed by her partner, Detective Michael Ortega. "Mr. Brooks," Detective Simmons began, her voice calm but piercing, "I need you to tell me what happened tonight. Walk me through everything." Daniel stared at her, his gaze unfocused, his hands resting on the metal table in front of him. He didn't know where to begin. His mind was still foggy, disconnected from the reality of the situation. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," he finally managed to say, his voice cracking. I found them. Clara and Harrison, he couldn't finish the sentence. The images of what he had seen earlier flooded his mind again, the betrayal, the agony, and his chest tightened with a wave of nausea. Detective Simmons leaned forward, her eyes never leaving him. "And what did you do when you saw them together, Mr. Brooks?" Daniel closed his eyes, the scene playing out in his mind. He saw Clara, her face flushed with shame, and Harrison, standing there like nothing had happened. His body trembled as he spoke again. "I don't know. I lost it. I felt like everything I worked for was a lie. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't stop myself. I attacked him." Detective Simmons nodded, her expression unreadable. "We're going to need a full statement, Mr. Brooks. But you understand the severity of your actions, don't you? You've not only destroyed your marriage, but you've also caused irreversible harm to Pastor Harrison." Daniel nodded, his hands shaking on the table. "I know," he whispered, his voice hollow. "I know." The room was stark and sterile, the harsh fluorescent lights overhead casting long shadows over the cold metal table where Daniel sat. He could feel the chill of the interrogation room settling deep into his bones, but it wasn't the cold that made him shiver, it was the overwhelming sense of loss, of destruction, that wrapped itself around him like a suffocating blanket. Detective Simmons and Detective Ortega sat across from him, their eyes studying him carefully, waiting for him to speak. Every word that left his mouth seemed too small to encompass the devastation he had caused, but it was all he had left. Daniel had never felt so alone. The once comfortable familiarity of his life, his marriage, had been ripped away, leaving him exposed to a harsh reality he hadn't been able to comprehend until now. The gravity of the situation, his actions, the irreversible damage, hung over him like a weight he couldn't shake. "Mr. Brooks," Detective Simmons' voice was steady, calm, but there was an undercurrent of something darker there, something that told him she had seen cases like his before. She folded her arms and leaned back in her chair. "You've already admitted to attacking Pastor Harrison Blackwell. What I need from you now is the full picture. How did this all begin?" Daniel's hands trembled as he placed them on the table, trying to steady himself. He couldn't look them in the eye, he couldn't look anyone in the eye right now. The image of Pastor Harrison's bloodied face, the horror in Clara's eyes, it all played out in his mind over and over again. His heart sank as he began to speak. "It started months ago," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Things between Clara and I, we were distant. We didn't talk like we used to. We were just going through the motions. And then she started volunteering at the church more. Helping out with the youth group, the charity events. I didn't think anything of it at first, but then she started spending more time there." He paused, shaking his head as the words spilled out of him. I didn't realize it at the time, but that's where it started. She and Harrison began spending more time together, talking, helping each other. I didn't see it. I didn't want to see it. I thought it was just work." Detective Ortega, who had been quiet up until now, spoke up. "But you saw them together tonight. That's when it all changed, right? You walked in on them. What was your first thought?" Daniel's heart pounded in his chest, and for a moment, he struggled to remember the exact sequence of events. The images of that moment were seared into his mind. Clara and Harrison, their bodies entangled on the desk, lost in the heat of their passion. It had been a moment of pure rage, a gut-wrenching shock that had clouded his judgment completely. He had acted on impulse, on blind fury, with no thought for the consequences. "I just couldn't breathe," Daniel admitted, his voice breaking. "I couldn't breathe and I couldn't think. I thought she loved me. I thought we were happy. And then I saw her with him. I don't know what happened after that. I don't know what came over me." He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to spill. "I just lost control. I wanted to hurt him. I wanted him to feel what I was feeling. I wanted to make them both feel like I felt." Detective Simmons nodded, her gaze never wavering. "And then you attacked him. You stabbed him with a letter opener." She leaned forward, her tone turning more serious. Do you understand that what you did tonight has consequences far beyond just a broken marriage? You've severely injured Pastor Blackwell. He may lose his eye, Daniel. You've escalated this situation into something far worse than just betrayal. Daniel's chest tightened as her words sank in. He had known the consequences of his actions, but hearing them from her, seeing the reality of what he had done, was like a punch to the gut. I didn't mean to hurt him that badly, Daniel whispered, his voice barely audible. I never meant for any of this to happen. I never meant for it to get this far. Detective Simmons studied him carefully, her expression unreadable. But it did, Mr. Brooks. It got this far because you lost control. You let your anger dictate your actions. You attacked someone in cold blood. The weight of her words hit him like a tidal wave. He hadn't just lost control for a few seconds. He had let rage define his every move, and now, lives were shattered beyond repair. His marriage was broken, Harrison's future was uncertain, and the community would never look at him the same way again. Daniel had no idea what would happen next, but he knew one thing for certain. There was no going back. As Daniel was led out of the interrogation room, the reality of what he had done began to settle over him like a dark cloud. He had been arrested. He had confessed to the assault. And now he would face whatever came next. He was placed in a holding cell, the cold walls closing in around him as he sat on the bench. The world outside had continued on, but for Daniel, time had stopped. He couldn't escape the crushing weight of his own guilt, the echoing screams of his conscience that reminded him of everything he had lost. He had loved Clara. He had built his life around her, around the promises they had made. But now those promises meant nothing. She was gone from him, lost in the ashes of their once perfect life. And Harrison, he didn't know if he would ever recover from the damage he had inflicted. Daniel had destroyed it all. Pastor Harrison Blackwell lay unconscious in a hospital bed, his face covered in bandages, his left eye swollen and damaged beyond recognition. The doctors had done their best to treat the wound, but the prognosis was unclear. The injury had been severe, and it was uncertain whether he would ever regain full use of his eye. But even if Harrison survived the physical injury, the emotional damage was far worse. The shame of what had transpired between him and Clara, and the consequences of his actions, weighed heavily on his mind. The once revered pastor was now the source of scandal, and his fall from grace had been swift and unforgiving. Clara had been taken to the station for questioning, but her mind was elsewhere. She hadn't seen Daniel since the chaos had erupted at the church. Her heart ached for him, for what he had done, for the man she had once loved and trusted. But it was too late. There was no going back. The affair with Harrison had shattered everything, her marriage, her faith, and her future. She was alone now, consumed by guilt, unsure of where to go or how to face the world again. News of the scandal spread through the small town like wildfire. The community that had once looked up to Pastor Harrison as a spiritual leader was now in shock. The church had been a pillar of strength for so many, a place where people sought guidance and comfort. But now it was tainted. And the reverberations of that night would be felt for years to come. Neighbors whispered in hushed voices, debating the morality of Daniel's actions and the scandal that had rocked their town. Some stood by him, claiming that his reaction was understandable, a product of betrayal. Others were appalled by the violence, condemning him for his brutality. But in the end, the truth was clear. Lives had been ruined, and there was no way to undo the damage that had been done. As the days passed, the consequences of that fateful night continued to unfold. Daniel was facing charges of aggravated assault, and Pastor Harrison's future remained uncertain. Clara, traumatized and alone, withdrew from the world around her, unsure of what the future held. The three of them, Daniel, Clara, and Harrison, were now forever tied together by the tragedy they had created. There was no easy path forward, no simple resolution. Each of them would have to reckon with the choices they had made, and the road ahead would be long, painful, and uncertain. But one thing was clear: nothing would ever be the same again. Their lives had been shattered, and the pieces could never be put back together. If you found this story as gripping as we did, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new episode. Share your thoughts in the comments. What do you think of the events that transpired? Who do you think is most to blame? Until next time, stay safe and keep questioning the truth.